You are here today, we are all here today for the second lecture from Dr. Lex McMillan, and I'd like everyone right now to give him a great big round of applause for choosing to come back after the reception he got last week. So if you haven't seen it yet, we are doing a year-long, in-depth into C.S. Lewis. This is our second lecture of that. We will be having lectures going on all the way until I think the end of March. We have a booklet that describes everything that's planned and scheduled. It's also in soft copy as well. And I think, along those lines, we have this Wednesday evening at, Jeff, what time?
7 to 8:30.
At 7 to 8:30. We have a book study going on, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the book, if you haven't been to one, I encourage you to come to one of the book studies. It doesn't matter, you don't have to attend every one of them. You'll get something out of each one that you come to, and I think that it would be edifying for you. And with that, at this point in time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lex McMillan for our second talk from him on C.S. Lewis.
Thank you, Stroud. Thanks very much. I asked Stroud not to give a long introduction, and I appreciate that because my overview is there in the booklet. So if you want to know more about such credentials as I have, it's there. I always caution people that I'm not an expert on C.S. Lewis. I wrote my dissertation on him, as those of you who were here last week know. And I'm just too curious to not ask. I shouldn't. I know. How many of you were here last week? Oh, well, God bless you. That's really good. I was hoping I'd get at least 3 or 4 hands up, but that's good. Well, I commend you. I thought it was really dangerous to have me leading off and succeeding myself. It'd be nice to kind of spread me out a little bit. But I do have some other gigs in the course of this year, and I'm delighted to be a part of this and happy to be a part of this. And volume okay in the back? You hear me okay? Yes? Okay? Good. So good morning, everyone, and I am honored and delighted to be here, and I thank all those who played a role, and certainly the church and the planning committee and all those who are responsible. It's a joy and an honor. Today, I want to give you an introduction, in fact, to the BBC radio talks that Lewis delivered between August 1941 and April 1944. And as most of you probably know, these talks ultimately became the much-loved book, Mere Christianity, which is still very available today. It was published in 1952, it's kind of a remarkable publishing story. George Marsden, a scholar who's written a book, I brought visual aids this time too, which I don't usually do, but let's see, yeah, there he is. George Marsden's book. I don't get any percentage for promoting the book, but it's called C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, a biography. Fascinating story about the origins of the book. But he said the book always sold well, but in an unusual trend, its popularity has grown with time. Since 2001, now this is, 40-some years after Lewis's death. Since 2001, Mere Christianity has sold more than 3.5 million copies in English. It has been translated into at least 36 languages and is said to be the book that, next to the Bible, educated Chinese Christians are most likely to have read. So if you really want to read more about the story of the sort of origins, the Marsden book is very good on that and very readable. So this topic today takes us deeply into 3 distinct focal points, if you will. First, the horrific time of England at war, World War II, under daily bombardments by the Germans, the Blitz. Second, the BBC emerging as a powerful international communications medium. And third, a major turning point in C.S. Lewis's life. These radio talks were the beginning of Lewis's emergence as a nationally and ultimately internationally loved, and in some quarters despised, apologist for Christianity. It all began on February 7, 1941, when the Reverend James Welch, the director of religious broadcasting at the BBC, wrote to Lewis to ask him whether he would, quote, be willing to help us in our work of religious broadcasting. Although Welch had never met Lewis, he had recently read with admiration Lewis's recently published The Problem of Pain. It was published the previous October. Welch had been recently appointed to his role and was a visionary innovator who realized that the times required a radical change in BBC programming if it were to realize its full potential as a force in the rapidly emerging new technology of radio, and particularly in the context of the dark days of Nazi conquest of Europe and the Blitz in London. So Welch was looking for fresh new voices to speak on religion to the British people. In Lewis, he suspected he had found a star. Little could he have imagined what his out-of-the-blue invitation would launch. In his letter, after thanking Lewis for writing The Problem of Pain, Welch acknowledged that the microphone is a limiting and often irritating instrument. Agree with that, whether on the radio or not. But he expressed his belief that the quality of thinking and the depth of conviction which he found in Lewis's book, quote, ought surely to be shared with a great many other people. He assured Lewis that the fairly intelligent, as he put it, BBC audience would exceed 1 million. As Justin Phillips observed in his carefully documented book, C.S. Lewis in a Time of War, that's my other visual aid, C.S. Lewis in a Time of War, very helpful in preparing this talk, Welch was taking a risk in offering this invitation without ever having heard Lewis speak. This is radio, after all. Quoting, although he could be fairly confident that an Oxford University lecturer would be able to acquit himself with honor in front of a microphone, close quote, there was no way to know how Lewis would sound, whether he would be effective or even whether his voice would carry over the radio. As we now know, they need not have worried, but still it was completely uncharted water. Lewis responded promptly on February 10 in writing, accepting Welch's suggestion of 4 15-minute talks and outlined the vision he had as follows, not quite what Welch had suggested actually. Quoting Lewis, it seems to me that the New Testament, by preaching repentance and forgiveness, always assumes an audience who already believe in the law of nature and know they have disobeyed it. In modern England, we cannot at present assume this, and therefore most apologetic begins a stage too far on. The first step is to create or recover the sense of guilt. Hence, if I gave a series of talks, I should mention Christianity only at the end, and prefer not to unmask my battery till then, end quote. It's interesting to note the military image that Lewis uses in his proposal to the Reverend Welch. Of course, England was at war at this time under daily attack by the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain dated from July to October 1940, the great air spectacle war over England. The Blitz began in September 1940 and continued till 10 May 1941, but German bombs fell on England off and on until near the war's end in 1945. It was a terribly fearful time that I think is difficult for any of us to imagine unless we had lived through it. Under these circumstances, it's not surprising that Lewis would use such imagery, warlike imagery, but this is a recurring image throughout his writings. One famous example from Mere Christianity will illustrate. Quoting, enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say landed in disguise, and is calling us to take part in a great campaign of sabotage, end quote. It's worth noting also that Lewis delighted in debate. He was a spirited, even pugnacious opponent in argument. He saw himself as a fighter, and he was certainly at times under fierce attack, as he continues to be today. At the time of Welch's letter, Lewis was actively looking for ways to contribute to the war effort by doing more than teaching the diminished number of undergrads who had not yet been called up. Those 18 to 20 were exempt from the draft. Although there were many fewer students at Oxford during the war, the university did remain open and Lewis taught and lectured throughout. Most considered this a sufficient contribution, a reserved activity, but Lewis wanted to do more. He volunteered to join the so-called Home Guard, which entailed his donning a military uniform, carrying a rifle, and walking around the less savory areas of Oxford for several hours at night, once every 9 days or so. More substantively, he had recently accepted an invitation to be a traveling lecturer for the Royal Air Force, a commitment which took up most of his weekends and holidays throughout the remainder of the war, traveling widely all across England, Scotland, and Wales, talking to the members of the RAF. He gave the first of these lectures in April 1941. Through his talks to the RAF, Lewis learned how to translate his faith into the everyday language of, as he put it, uneducated people. Reflecting on that experience in a talk he later gave to a clerical group on the issue of apologetics, he observed, quote, "I've come to the conclusion that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning," end quote. Lewis clearly felt a call to evangelize very soon after his conversion to Christianity in 1931. His first published book after his conversion was entitled The Pilgrim's Regress, published in 1933, with a somewhat cumbersome subtitle of An Allegorical Apology for Christianity, Reason, and Romanticism. It is, as the title suggests, and as Lewis affirmed, a conscious allusion to one of the most famous works of Christian apologetics in Western literature, namely John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Published in 1678, this classic of English religious literature has been translated into more than 200 languages and has never been out of print. Lewis described his book as an updated Bunyan, but the comparison ends there. The characters and the topography of the allegorical landscape that Lewis portrays bear little resemblance to Bunyan's classic. Lewis himself later acknowledged the failure of the book, both for its obscurity as well as its bad temper. In a subsequent edition, Lewis added notations to help clarify the allegory. He did so grudgingly, however, recognizing, as he did as a scholar of allegory, that when successful, it illuminates ideas, not taxing the reader into a sort of treasure hunt for hidden meanings. By the way, for those of you who are interested, one of the speakers in this series will be Dr. David Downing, formerly of Elizabethtown College, who will be joined by his wife, Crystal. They're now the co-directors of the Wade Center at Wheaton College, just went out this summer. And Dr. Downing has done several years ago a wonderful annotated edition of The Pilgrim's Regress. So if you want to read The Pilgrim's Regress, you want to get Dr. Downing's copy of it because it explains all the allusions and unclear things. The Downings will be here, by the way, the culminating weekend, March 22, March 23. I bring all this up because there's a direct line from the publications of The Pilgrim's Regress to the BBC radio talks. You thought I'd forgotten about them? No. In the summer of 1939, Mr. Ashley Sampson, the owner of a small publishing firm in London, wrote Lewis inviting him to contribute a book on the intellectual problems associated with human pain for their Christian Challenge series. Sampson had read with admiration The Pilgrim's Regress and Out of the Silent Planet, the first book in Lewis's space trilogy, which had appeared coincidentally on this very date in 1938, 80 years ago. He expressed his opinion that Lewis was just the man to write on this topic. That first nonfiction apologetic work appeared in late 1940, and as noted above, it was the work that caught the attention of the Reverend James Welch at the BBC. The problem of pain is an ambitious assault on one of the most formidable and perennial obstacles to Christian faith. Simply put, if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, how can he allow pain and suffering in the world? From the earliest days of Christianity, this question has challenged theologians and philosophers defending the faith from their lofty towers to ordinary pastors consoling grief-stricken members of their flocks. Given the death of his mother when he was 9, the subsequent alienation from his father, and Lewis's experience in the trenches of France where he was seriously wounded, the problem of pain figured largely among the reasons he had once given for rejecting Christianity. He forcefully summarizes the argument for atheism in the very first chapter of The Problem of Pain. I'll quote a lengthy passage to give you a sense of the way he set the argument up. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, "Why do you not believe in God?" my reply would have run something like this. By far the greatest, look at the universe we live in. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. It is so arranged that all the forms of life can live only by preying upon one another. In the lower forms, this process entails only death. But in the higher, there appears a new quality called consciousness, which enables it to be attended with pain. The creatures cause pain by being born, and live by inflicting pain, and in pain they mostly die. In the most complex of all the creatures, man, yet another quality appears, which we call reason, whereby he is able to foresee his own pain, and to foresee his own death while keenly desiring permanence. It also enables men, by 100 ingenious contrivances, to inflict a great deal more pain than they otherwise could have done on one another and on the irrational creatures. This power they have exploited to the full. Their history is largely a record of crime, war, disease, and terror. Every now and then they improve their condition a little and what we call a civilization appears. But all civilizations pass away, and even while they remain, inflict peculiar sufferings of their own. Even if it should not, what then? The race is doomed, for the universe is running down, and will sometime be a uniform infinity of homogeneous matter at a low temperature. All stories will come to nothing. All life will turn out to have been a transitory and senseless contortion upon the idiotic face of infinite matter. If you ask me to believe that this is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. And I hope that will whet your appetite for reading the book, because how in the world does he answer that? It's a great rhetorical turn. It's fairly obvious once you read it. It would be difficult to find a more comprehensive argument for unbelief, as well as the scope of the challenge that Lewis had undertaken. Its very force gives us a sense of how deeply Lewis held his convictions of disbelief before his conversion. It also shows how profound that conversion was, not merely a return to the faith of his childhood, but a complete remaking of his mind and spirit. Although the faults of the book have been documented, it has proven to be remarkably enduring, continuing in print like so many of the others, now almost 80 years after it first appeared. In an appraisal of the problem of pain, his friend, the English philosopher and theologian Austin Farrer, observed that Lewis, quote, discloses the unique transcendent claim of the love of God with a controlled and reasonable passion that is theophanic. Yes, says the willing reader, that is God. We think we're listening to an argument. In fact, we are presented with a vision, and it is the vision that carries conviction, end quote. In his preface, Lewis makes it clear that he's not an expert, nor a theologian, just a layman and an amateur. However, he anticipates his goal in what would become mere Christianity when he writes, I have believed myself to be restating ancient and orthodox doctrines. If any part of the book are original in the sense of being novel or unorthodox, they are so against my will and as a result of my ignorance. I write, of course, as a layman of the Church of England, but I have tried to assume nothing that is not professed by all baptized and communicating Christians. It was central to Lewis's vocation as a Christian apologist that he not engage in the controversies that have sadly divided and subdivided Christianity. As he explained in his preface to Mere Christianity, he felt deeply, quote, the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times, end quote. So Lewis's aim as a Christian apologist, as he expressed it in The Problem of Pain, was precisely what James Welch and his BBC colleagues were seeking, a clear and persuasive voice that was not speaking for any particular branch of Christianity. Since BBC's religious programming before the war had been dominated by clergymen, and particularly those of the Church of England, that Lewis was a layman and not a professional theologian was a plus. Lewis firmly believed that what he called mere Christianity is something not only positive but pungent, divided from all non-Christian belief by a chasm to which the worst divisions inside Christendom are not really comparable at all. And he found it curiously consoling that the most hostile reactions he had received came not from convinced members of communions different from my own, but from what he called the borderline people, those not exactly obedient to any communion. He affirmed his conviction that, quote, it is at her center where her truest children dwell, that each communion is really closest to every other in spirit, if not in doctrine. And this suggests at the center of each there is something or a someone who, against all divergences of belief, all differences of temperament, all memories of mutual persecution, speaks with the same voice, end quote. After accepting Welch's offer and agreeing on the general shape of the first talks, Welch turned him over to his colleague, the Reverend Eric Finn, a Presbyterian minister and a committed ecumenist, also a pacifist, by the way, and he had spent time in jail during World War I for that conviction. Like Lewis, he aimed to find the common ground among Christians which would unite rather than divide. He would become Lewis's editor, producer, and collaborator in the broadcast talks, Although his relationship with Lewis was at times testy, Lewis never had a co-author before, they developed a partnership that merits credit for Lewis's success in what was for him an entirely new medium. And the detailed and fascinating account of their relationship is found in Justin Phillips's book, which I just referenced. Noting the press of his academic duties, Lewis agreed to give the first talks in August 1941 during summer break. It was a year of astonishing, 1941, a year of astonishing productivity for Lewis. In addition to his academic duties and scholarly work, Lewis had already begun writing and publishing his 31 screwtape letters in The Guardian, which were published in The Guardian, an Anglican newspaper. They appeared weekly between May and November of 1941. In June, he preached The Weight of Glory to a packed house at St. Mary the Virgin Church in Oxford. And if you're not familiar with this sermon, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of rhetoric and beautiful homilies I've ever read. Here's a little taste of one of my favorite Lewis quotes from The Weight of Glory. "It is a serious thing," he says, "to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, in some degree, we are helping each other to one or other of these destinations. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors." End quote. I'm confident that this soaring vision of the high stakes involved in being human were very much on Lewis's mind as he took up the task of writing his scripts for the BBC radio talks. Also in 1941, in December, Lewis had agreed to be the founding president of Oxford's Socratic Club, an undergraduate forum for discussion and debate of the difficulties and objections to Christian faith. It was a post he held until taking a professorship at Cambridge University in 1954. Also in December 1941, he gave a series of lectures on Milton's Paradise Lost at the University College of North Wales. These were later published as a preface to Paradise Lost, which continues to be a standard reference for students of Milton's great work. Beyond 1941, it's stunning to see how productive he was from the time of his conversion, almost as if a great flood of creative and scholarly energy was unleashed by this pivotal event. From the time of his conversion, he published more than 40 books, scores of essays, articles, reviews, and poems, gave hundreds of talks, and kept up a worldwide correspondence that is now collected in 3 hefty volumes totaling more than 3,700 pages. I've not read all of them. Read a lot of them, and I'm sure that's not all of them. Those are the ones they were able to collect. Lewis's voluminous correspondence was directly the result of his BBC radio talks and grew even larger with the publication of the Screwtape Letters in 1942 and then in the US in 1943. Indeed, immediately following the very first set of the radio talks, he was overwhelmed and dismayed by the volume of letters he received. In one day, he received over 300. Although the letters contained both adoration and angry objections, most were earnest appeals for counsel and guidance. Lewis felt a moral obligation to answer them, which he dutifully did, mostly by hand for the remainder of his life. Later in his life, his brother Warren, who could type with 2 fingers, helped with some of the correspondence. Lewis never learned to type. Lewis traveled by train from Oxford to give his first radio talk live from the BBC Broadcasting House in London on Wednesday, August 6, 1941, from 7:45 to 8 p.m. Now, that might seem to be a primetime slot, but it turned out it was not. The preceding program was a news broadcast in Norwegian for the Nazi-occupied people of Norway. It was followed by some songs from the Welsh Cultural Festival. Nothing against the Welsh, of course, but not exactly the prime time he might have hoped for. Gradually, the BBC did give him better time slots, and all but 4 of the last series given in 1944 were broadcast live from London. It's also worth noting that when Lewis accepted the BBC invitation in early 1941, the German Blitz was in full fury. As George Marsden has pointed out in his fine little book about mere Christianity, Between September 1940 and May 1941, the German Luftwaffe poured bombs on London 71 times, killing over 20,000 citizens and seriously injuring tens of thousands more. At one point, the relentless pounding went on 57 nights in a row. You can imagine that. Casualties often numbered over 1,000 on a single night. The BBC Broadcasting House itself in London was struck twice with loss of life during this period. Knowing of this mortal danger, Lewis accepted the invitation anyway. Fortunately, by August, the intense bombing had abated. The so-called Blitz had more or less ended, but still continued bombing sporadically, so one never knew. Lewis ultimately gave 4 series of radio talks in his initial engagement with the BBC. The first, given on 4 consecutive Wednesdays in late summer 1941, was comprised of 4 15-minute talks entitled Right and Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. At the invitation of the BBC, he added a 5th talk to respond to listeners' objections or questions and try and reduce the amount of letters coming to him directly. That is now the chapter 2 in the first book of Mere Christianity. Lewis was required to submit all of his scripts for the radio talks weeks in advance of their broadcast, both so Eric Finn, his editor, could review and offer comments and suggestions, which sometimes he did voluminously, good suggestions, but also in order that they could be read by the wartime censors. Once approved, nothing read on the air of the BBC was done without being reviewed and approved by censors. Once approved, Lewis had no discretion for changes. He was required to read them exactly as approved by the censors. It was also very important that each talk run exactly the allotted time. Dead air on the BBC was constantly at risk of being filled with German propaganda from the Irish-American Nazi collaborator known as Lord Haw Haw, Germany Calling, and others. As noted above, Lewis's aim in the first series of talks was what he called a preparatio evangelica, that is, preparing the ground for the gospel, rather than explicitly presenting it. He wanted to convince his listeners that there is a moral law widely recognized by all people, whether educated or uneducated, that all recognize we failed to live up to it, no matter how hard we try, and that the existence of a lawgiver is at least highly probable. The second series, 5 talks entitled What Christians Believe, was given on Sunday afternoons in January and February 1942. Here Lewis focused on key articles of the Christian faith, including the Christian view of God as a loving creator, actively involved in his creation and with his creatures. In the first of these talks, he notes that Christians, and I think a little tongue-in-cheek, but this is a response to a question that came up last time actually, Christians do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. If you're an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you're a Christian, you're free to think that all of these religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of the truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered most to them. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view, end quote. In this series, he dealt with original sin, the existence of fallen angels or devils who have taken over the world, enemy-occupied territory, you'll recall, the redemptive action of Christ, the necessity of penitence is another thing, but penitence, the value of baptism, faith, and Holy Communion. He covers an extraordinary amount of territory in 5 15-minute talks, and this has, of course, opened him to the criticism of oversimplifying matters of a great complexity, which he did. And Lewis recognized this, and he said, if anyone wanted to take a better shot at it, let him have at it. The third was a series of 8 10-minute talks entitled Christian Behavior, also given on Sunday afternoons. These talks comprise the third book of Mere Christianity, more or less, but are the ones he edited the most because he had originally thought the time allotment was still 15 minutes. I can't find anywhere why they moved it to 10, but that was a fact. And they told him that he'd missed that. So after preparing all of his texts as usual, well in advance of the broadcast, and submitting them for review, he discovered to his great dismay that he would need to cut approximately 600 words from each of them. The allotted time had been cut to 10 minutes. When he revised these talks for publication as Mere Christianity, he restored much of that cut material. In this series, he deals with morality, the cardinal virtues, social relations, psychoanalysis, sexuality, marriage, forgiveness, pride, which he points out the greatest of sins, charity, hope, and faith. As you might imagine, these talks, especially his treatment of marriage as a single man, and traditional Christian teaching on sex, generated a great deal of mail, some of it hostile. After an interlude of more than a year, Lewis gave the final series 7 15-minute talks entitled Beyond Personality, The Christian View of God. Here he acknowledged that he had been warned not to deal with the topics of this series. They all say the ordinary reader does not want theology. Give him plain, practical religion. I have rejected their advice. I do not think the ordinary reader is such a fool, he wrote. In these talks, he dealt with the doctrine of the Trinity, creation, the incarnation, the two natures of Jesus Christ, the resurrection, and the ascension. Again, a stunningly ambitious scope for such brief talks. Due to some scheduling complications, these talks were moved to the inconveniently late hour of 10:20 p.m. on successive Sundays from February to April 1944. This required Lewis to arrive in London late in the evening and then return to Oxford, arriving at his home around 3 a.m. The reason behind that has more of his domestic relations that I'll go into. Lewis was decidedly unhappy about this burden and persuaded the BBC to record 4 of the talks on the 3 nights when he broadcast live from London. In this series, there was another misunderstanding about the length of time, only this time it was the opposite of the 3rd series. Lewis thought this was to give another series of 10-minute talks and prepared them accordingly. And very late in the process, Eric Finn discovered to his dismay that all the talks were too short for the allotted 15 minutes. So Lewis went back and expanded them. Although there are a number of other recordings of Lewis's voice, only one of the 4 recordings from his BBC talks on Christianity survives. It was his last talk entitled The New Man, delivered on April 4, 1944. It is largely, although not precisely, the last chapter in the 4th book of Mere Christianity, entitled The New Men. And one can easily find it on YouTube, maybe Yahoo too, but YouTube. So to close my presentation this morning, I would like to share about a 10-minute portion of that last radio broadcast, the only surviving recording. And just mention, if you're interested, my last prop, if you'd like to hear more of Lewis's voice, I think I mentioned last time, the Protestant Episcopal radio television station of Atlanta, Georgia, reached out to Lewis in the late 50s or early 60s and went to England and recorded him giving talks on what became the book, The Four Loves. And so on CD, available rather cheaply through Amazon or wherever, you can get the complete recordings of Lewis's broadcast, if you will, of The Four Loves, the origin of that book. So that's interesting too. So thank you for your kind attention. We'll go straight into those talks, I hope. That talk.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self. And that this process goes on very far inside. One's most private wish, one's point of view of things that have to be changed. That's why unbelievers complain that Christianity is a very selfish religion. Isn't it very selfish, even morbid, they say, to be always bothering about the inside of our own soul, instead of thinking of humanity? Now, what would an NCO say to a soldier who had a dirty rifle, and when told to clean it, replied, "But Sergeant, isn't it very selfish, even morbid, to be always bothering about the inside of our own rifle, instead of thinking of the United Nations?" Well, we didn't bother about what the NCO would actually say. You see the point? The man's not going to be much use to the United Nations if his rifle isn't fit to shoot with. In the same way, people who are still acting from their own natural selves won't do much real permanent good to other people. Let me explain that. History isn't just a story of bad people doing bad things. It's quite as much a story of people trying to do good things, but somehow something goes wrong. Take the common expression, cold as charity. How do you come to say that? Well, experience. We've learned how unsympathetic, patronizing, and conceited charitable people often are. And yet, hundreds and thousands of them started out really anxious to do good. And when they'd done it, somehow it just wasn't as good as it ought to have been. The old story. What you are comes out in what you do. A crabapple tree can't produce eating apples. As long as the old self is there, its taint will be over all we do. We try to be religious and become Pharisees. We try to be kind and become patronizing. Social service ends in red tape and officialdom. Unselfishness becomes a form of showing off. I don't mean, of course, that we must stop trying to be good. We've got to do the best we can. If the soldier's fool enough to go into battle with a dirty rifle, he mustn't run away. But I do mean that the real cure lies far deeper. Out of ourselves and into Christ we must go. The change won't, for most of us, happen suddenly. And I must admit that for most Christians, it'll only be beginning to the very end of our present lives. But there are some in whom it goes further, even before death, far enough for you to see it. Their very faces and voices are different. When you meet them, you know you're up against something which, so to speak, begins where you leave off. Something stronger, quieter, happier, more alive than ordinary humanity. Now, that's just where Christianity, as I think, has the real answer to a question a lot of modern people are asking. Everyone's heard of evolution, how men evolve from lower types of life. And people often ask, what's the next step? When is the thing beyond man going to appear? Some imaginative writers even try to picture what the next step will be like, but they usually end in nonsense about men with 6 arms or wings or something of that kind. But the Christians think those people are on the wrong tack. The next step has already appeared. The next step is from being mere creatures to being sons of God. The new kind of man appeared in Christ. And other new men, little Christ, are already to be found, dotted here and there about the earth. We Christians don't call it evolution, because we believe it isn't something coming up out of blind nature, but something coming down from a world of light and power and knowledge beyond all nature. But if you like to call it evolution, do. The next step is here. You can become one of the new men in Christ if you like. Or, if you prefer, you can refuse the step and sink back. Now, if we take the step, it involves losing what we now call ourselves. That doesn't mean that all the people who accept Christ are going to be exactly like one another. I know it sounds a bit big. If there's one Christ, and he's to be in us all, actually replacing our personalities with his own, what difference will there be between us? Now, here I've got a rather difficult thing to say. On the one hand, it isn't true that we shall lose our personal differences by letting Christ take us over. On the other hand, I don't think Christ can take us over as long as we're bothering about what will happen to our personality. Can I take the first point first? If a person didn't know about salt, wouldn't he think that anything with such a strong taste would kill the taste of all the other things in any dish you put it into? We know that, as a matter of fact, it brings out their real taste. Well, it's rather like that with Christ. When you've completely given up yourself to his personality, you will then, for the first time in your life, developing into a real person. He made the whole world. He invented, as an author invents characters in a book, all different men that you and I were intended to be. Our real selves are, so to speak, all waiting for us in Him. What I call myself now is hardly a person at all. It's mainly a meeting place for various natural forces, desires and fears, etc., some of which come from my ancestors, and some from my education, some perhaps from devils. The self you are really intended to be is something that lives not from nature, but from God. At the beginning of these talks, I said there were personalities in God. Well, I go further now. There are no real personalities anywhere else. I mean, no full, complete personalities. It's only when you allow yourself to be drawn into His life that you turn into a true person. But on the other hand, it's just no good at all going to Christ for the sake of developing a fuller personality. As long as that's what you're talking about, you haven't begun it. Because the very first step towards getting a real self is to forget about the self. It will come only if you're looking for something else. That holds, you know, even for us, you know. Even in literature or art, no man who cares about originality will ever be original. It's the man who's only thinking about doing a good job or telling the truth who becomes really original and doesn't notice it. Even in social life, you never make a good impression on other people until you stop thinking what sort of impression you make. That principle runs all through life from the top to the bottom. Give up yourself and you'll find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, submit with every fibre of your being, and you'll find eternal life. Look for Christ and you'll get Him, and with Him everything else thrown in. Look for yourself and you'll get only hatred, loneliness, despair, ruin.
That's upbeat ending, isn't it? Thank you all for your attention, and if you have questions for a few minutes, I would attempt to, or even comments. Can we get the lights back up? Yeah, oops. Questions, comments, observations? I've left you speechless. I don't know whether you noticed it, maybe it's just because I'm so much more familiar, but one of the things that strikes me in listening to this again is a sort of humor that is around the edge. A very, very light touch, a kind of earnestness, of course, in sharing something he thinks terribly important. But, you know, the illustration of the rifle, the soldier with his rifle, it's a very playful image, obviously, and partly based on his own experience in the military. There's a comment over here.
Probably a call for speculation more than anything else.
Yeah.
But what do you make of the juxtaposition of the timing of the war with his burst of creativity and kind of the intersection of those things? It seems like Christianity seems to strangely thrive when it's struck in some way. I wonder how the personal level perspective.
A couple of thoughts. Number one, the burst of creativity actually preceded the war substantially. In fact, when the war came, he was really in his stride, professionally speaking, and he was gaining recognition as a distinguished scholar, and was, I guess in 1938, I think, his great book on medieval romance and allegory, the Allegory of Love, was published, and he won prizes and kudos for that. He said at one point to his old friend Arthur Greaves that perhaps it's just as well that we're going to war. I was getting entirely too comfortable anyway, complacent in my own success. You know, So just in terms of chronology, the war was not exactly the stimulus, if you will, although it certainly played a part, as I've tried to describe today, because of the BBC talks, essentially, where he was really sincerely looking at, I've condensed it greatly, he went kind of knocking on a number of doors, including the president of his college and other officials. He was offered a position in the Ministry of Information. He goes, he said, even if it's our propaganda, I'm not doing propaganda, you know. So he had volunteered to teach cadets, and that had been dismissed. I don't understand why. So he was earnestly looking for some way to contribute to the war effort in a more substantive way than merely teaching his classes and marching about Oxford once every 9 days. And so when the BBC thing came along, there was this confluence of his desire to do something of service and his own sense of great commitment as a popular evangelist. You know, that was very clear in a point I tried to make, that he turned to writing the Pilgrim's Regress virtually within a year of his conversion. It was very fresh, and sat down and wrote it in a period of about 2 weeks while he was on holiday in Ireland. He was actually, just one of the reasons he could be so productive. He was obviously a genius of a certain kind, and he very rarely even made a second draft. He just wrote it out. And people also said he was an amazingly effective public speaker because he gave the impression of speaking extemporaneously. When he gave his inaugural address at Cambridge, De Descriptione Temporum, which goes on, it's a lengthy, I think to read it would probably take about 45 to 50 minutes. It's a lengthy, detailed, very thoughtful, sophisticated argument about historical time, if you will, and the development of Western civilization and certain benchmarks in Western civilization. People had the impression he was speaking extemporaneously. He was actually speaking from a text. In fact, he handed the text over to be published, and it was published very shortly thereafter. The thing is, he had a photographic memory. So once he had written it down, he was just reading it right out of his head. He didn't have to look at his text. It was just there. It's really kind of remarkable. So that was part of his great effectiveness, of course, as a public speaker. It's an interesting question. I mean, the only other thought that comes to me, and it's a truism, is that in times of war, people start asking religious questions, or in times of panic or dread or terror. You know, we all schlep along and feel like we're pretty good people and everything's going along swimmingly, as long as things are going swimmingly, until you get a diagnosis that you're suffering a terminal illness. And then terminal questions come up, you know. So, anyway, other questions, comments? Yes?
I've been trying for some time to wrap my mind around what I think is an incredibly unifying aspect of Lewis. By unifying, I mean the enduring respect from Christians of all ilk.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, I'm not sure if I'm actually as correct in thinking that he's as unifying as I do. But so that's kind of my first thing that I'm trying to understand if he really is as remarkable and unifying figure as is my impression. And if so, I can't wrap my mind around how that's possible. I heard, you know, a few things that you said about on one hand, he doesn't shy away from things. He's clearly very candid, forthright. On the other hand, he's very concerned with unity and didn't go after controversial topics and subjects.
Right.
But particularly when you think about the state of Christianity today in the United States, worldwide, he still somehow seems to have a unifying aspect. You don't see large swaths of criticism or criticism from large swaths of Christian communities, or conservative, progressive, denominationally. I find that remarkable, but I can't wrap my mind around it. I wonder if you have any thoughts or insight on it.
Well, he's probably the best source of it himself. If you read the preface, I think it's called preface, his preface to Mere Christianity. And speaking of which, by the way, I discovered this recently. My old edition is right over here, just after you. This is my edition of Mere Christianity from, I think, 1972. Well marked up and highlighted and annotated as you would expect, and beginning to break in the bindings. Be very careful so the pages don't pop out. All my old paper books are getting old, like me. But his essay there is, and I've alluded to it in this talk and also in last week's talk, that he's able to find common ground across denominations because he very assiduously tries to avoid getting into theological disputes that have divided Christendom. So, for example, when he talks about the way in which the Christ life is communicated or transmitted, one of the things he talks about is how different Christians call it different things. Some call it the Mass, some call it Holy Communion, some call it the Eucharist, some call it the Lord's Supper, and it doesn't matter what you call it. There is this thing that God tells us to do pretty clearly in order to transmit his Spirit in us, and that is eat the bread and drink the wine. He said, as he says simply, I think it's in Christianity, he says, this may strike some of us as being very unspiritual, but we can't be more spiritual than God. God made matter. He likes matter. So, you really can find people who find Lewis troubling and off-putting. And he's dated. I mean, I was wincing actually all the way through this chapter about the men. I go, women, he's talking about women also, But also, I mean, I would say in defense of that, I recognize the sensitivity about using gender-inclusive language, and I try and do that. But also, as a student of English language and literature, know that, we have a language where words have multiple meanings. The same word can mean lots of different things. And man is one of them. And sometimes it refers to, the male of the species, if you will, and sometimes it means humanity. Now, if people are offended by that, then that's fine. I'll try and say humanity instead of men, But Lewis was not constrained or even aware, probably, of that kind of a concern. It was a very standard usage. He certainly, if challenged on it, you do mean women too, don't you, Mr. Lewis? He goes, well, of course, I said men. And certainly, his teaching, his explication of Christianity is what most would think of as sort of traditional orthodoxy. And there's a lot of range of opinion and thought about what Christians should believe and how Christians should act. In the radio talks, and of course in Mere Christianity, he says, when he talks on the chapter about forgiveness, he said, he recalls in the previous talk, he had talked about sexual morality and traditional Christian teaching on sexual morality. And he said, this is probably the most unpopular teaching that Christianity has today. And then he started the chapter on forgiveness. He goes, I said that, and I'm beginning to think that actually forgiveness might be even less popular. Think about it, And he said, I've talked to people, I've talked about this, where they're positively offended that I would suggest that you forgive somebody. You're going to forgive the Gestapo? You're going to forgive the Nazis? Well, that's actually what we're called to do. Yep. He says, don't start there. Start with your mother-in-law. Something, a little hill you can climb more easily than the Gestapo. Maybe you're not even called to think about the Gestapo or whatever latest outrage. So, it's quite true. There certainly are folks who don't find Lewis their cup of tea, but it's also absolutely true. It's remarkable, really, how many of his books, including his scholarly books, The Allegory of Love, of all things, is still in print. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of books of that kind. Certainly happy to be corrected. One person here probably could correct me, but a book on a major literary topic published in 1938 that it continues to be reprinted. Now, it might not be because people are so interested in medieval romance and it's just another Lewis book, and the name itself and the publishers know that there are people out there who are Lewis crazy and will buy anything that's got his name on it. And that has generated a major cottage industry. I would say there have been at least 40 other books by C.S. Lewis, if you will, after his death, which really were books compiled of essays and talks and unpublished things pulled together by Walter Hooper, his posthumous secretary. And so there are many, many books. I'm losing the crowd, and we're past the time, so I will stop, and thank you again for being here, but I'll hang around if you want to talk after.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you want to stick around, I didn't ask Lex about this, but I'm going to offer it up anyway. If you want to stick around and ask more questions, I'm sure he would be comfortable to do so, as he did last week. One thing that I meant to mention at the beginning that I forgot, and that is something that Lex was talking about with respect to Lewis and being a person of his time. We have, in the Episcopal Church, moved well beyond some of his viewpoints in social morality, and we're not timid about that. And so I encourage you, as you read Lewis, if you're finding specific things such as details, focus more on what he said we should focus on, and that is on Christ, and let everything else get worked out. All right, thank you very much. Please open up for questions.